Hi everyone, myself Dr. M. Lakshmi Prasad, working as an associate professor in the Department of Data Science in Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. So in this video, I'm going to discuss about what are the various sources of primary and secondary sources. The examples I'm going to explain now. So comes to introduction of primary and secondary source. So already I discussed some topics that are related to the primary source and secondary sources. So in this we will see in detail about what are the various examples of primary sources and secondary sources, so that we can able to identify clearly what are the primary and what are the secondary. Then how we're going to extract the sources and all. I can able to explain in detail now. So before going to see that example, so first of all, you have to know about what is the primary source and what are the secondary sources. So what are the primary sources actually? So the primary sources are nothing but the original records from the past record are identified or recorded by the people who are involved in the event and are witness of the event or can able to know the persons involved in the event. Suppose if some events are going to organize, right? So in that one, we have to who are the persons involved in that one and the witness of the event, and then the persons who are involved in this event new to that one can able to identify. So the primary sources are nothing but the original records. All that I'm going to call it as, right. So, but that should be come from the past recorded by the people. So based on the fields like who are the persons involved in that one, and then witness of the event, and who are the persons involved in that one. And similarly, they can also be objects or artifacts you can able to call, or visual evidence should be there. Then only I can able to add set this is the data come from the primary source. So otherwise I can able to guess it whether it is a primary or secondary. So what is the objects that is getting, right? So whether it may be objects or artifacts, then or visual evidence should be there compulsory. And then the primary source can also be give an idea about the people who are alive at the time, saw or through or thought about that event, right? So the primary source may able to give some idea the who are the people alive at this time, and then can able to also give the idea about the thought about the event. So the signal will comes under the primary sources. Keep in mind that the primary source is able to reflect only one point of view and may contain only a person's bias that is prejudiced towards an event. Otherwise, can able to set one point of view. Otherwise, the primary source can able to reflect only one point of view, and then it can able to identify the person bias that is not the prejudice and then towards an event. So, what are some of the examples of primary source? Suppose the best examples of this primary source will be books or magazines or newspapers. So these are some of the examples actually. So books. Suppose if I consider the books means all the data is going to be come from the primary source only, right? The person who is going to author the book, that should become a primary source. And then magazines should also be a source of the primary data, since all the research activities and then all the current running data is going to be displayed on magazines, so it should also become the example of the primary source. And newspapers also to be an primary source example, because what is the activities and what is the information that is going on in the present world is going to be can able to see through the newspapers only, right? So then the newspaper should also become an example of this primary source. So right, so books is also one of the example of the primary source. And then magazines, so magazines should also be one of the primary source. And then newspapers should also become an example of the primary source. Whatever the publication that is printed should also be an example of the primary source. And some other examples of the primary source will be diaries and then journals, records, etc. All the personal records should also become under the example of this primary source, right? Diaries. So diaries means everyone has to maintain some diary, right? So that diary is maintained what is the information that is written on that should be a primary source only. So since each and every person has to write his own diary, and then generals, and then records, the records what we have taken, and then generals diaries and all, right? So these are all also personal records. So what is the personal record of each and every individual should also be an example of this primary source. And the next one is that visual materials. So visual materials nothing but paintings and drawings and sculpture like this. So these are some of the examples of the primary source also. So the visual materials like paintings. So right, so the painting that has drawn by a single kid or person should also be one of the examples, and then drawings, and then sculpture, right? Whatever it may be, the paintings it should also be one of the painting or right. By seeing this also the visual materials, you can able to extract the data. So that should become a visual material, which may simultaneously leads to the primary resource and all, right? So visual materials would also comes under the example of the primary source. And then some other examples of this primary source will be photographs, and then films, and then maps. So the data what I'm going to extract from the photography should also be an example of the primary source, and then the films, the film history, right? What the picture is taken. So that and all will comes under the primary source, and then maps. So the map data, by seeing the map, I can able to identify. So by seeing the location or some other place I want to visit, so through the map, so that should be a primary source, right? So all these visual materials and all will comes under the primary visual material comes under the examples of this primary source. And then some other examples of the primary source will be oral histories, like so the chronicles, Deccan Chronicles, and then memories, myths, legends passed down by the word of the mouth. So these and all will comes under the examples of this primary source also. So oral histories, that means the chronicles, and then memories of the persons and myths, and then legends that should be passed on by the word of the mouth. So that should be comes under the oral histories. So this should also be become an example of this primary source here. And then some other examples of the primary source will be songs, and then poems should also becomes under this. So whatever may be the songs, right? And then poems, what I have written, some of this should also comes under the example of this primary source. So all this the songs will also be comes under this, right? So the data that is the songs what have been sung by the individual singers should also be source of the primary. And then the poems what they have written, initially written, like in textbooks and all, many of the children have learned this, right? The poems, that one also will comes under the primary source. And then some of the other examples of the primary source will be artifacts. So artifacts may be the tools, ornaments, and objects, right? So these and all will also comes under the examples of the primary source. Actually, right, the tools. So the tools, the what they initially made by some other people, and then ornaments, and then objects, whatever these are historical tools, and then historical ornaments, and then objects. So this and also will be the example of the primary source actually. And then secondary source. So just now what I said should be the primary source examples like artifacts, right? So the printed publications, so one of the example of the primary source, just now I said, there should be magazines, books, and then newspapers. So all this comes under the example of primary source. And the personal records like diaries, journals, records, so whatever it may be. So the personal record should also be example of the primary source. And then visual materials like paintings, drawings, and then sculpture, so it should also be the example of primary source. And then visual materials like photography, films, and then maps, so whatever it may be, so those and all will under comes under visual materials, also the examples of the primary source. And then oral histories, and then songs and poems should also be example of primary source. And then artifacts like historical tools, ornaments, and then objects will also be the example of primary source. And then what are the secondary sources now? So secondary source are nothing but made at later time, should be considered as a secondary source, and they can include only the written information by the historians or others after an event has been taken place. So some event is going on, right? So once that event is done, so what is the information that has been taken out after that event? So that should be the example of the secondary source. So the secondary sources are going to be made at a later time, which may also include, so secondary sources are made at later time, and they can also be include the information by the historians or others after an event has been taken place. So although this may be useful and then reliable, but they cannot reflect what the people who lived at the time thought or felt about the event, right? So, but they can able to represent more fair about account of the event, because they can include more than one point of view, or may include information about that was unavailable at the time of the event here, right? So what are the secondary sources that can should be useful and reliable, but they cannot reflect what the people who lived at the time thought or felt about that event, should also be example of the secondary source. So but the secondary source are able to represent more fair account of the event, because they can include more than one point of view, or it may also include information that was unavailable at the time of the event also. So see the examples of this secondary sources. So textbooks. So textbooks will comes under the example of the secondary source, and then the biographies, and then histories, and then newspaper report by someone who was not present. So textbooks, and then biographies, and then histories, and then newspaper report by someone who was not at present. So these are all the example of the secondary source here. Some other examples of the secondary source will be charts, and then graphs or images created after the time period. So that should be the example of the secondary source. So the graph charts what I have prepared, whether it may be bar chart, pie chart, whatever it may be, and then the graphs and the images, so what have been created after the time period, is nothing but the example of this secondary source here. So these are some of the examples of the secondary source actually. So the secondary source mainly will be the textbooks, and then biographies, and then histories, and the newspaper report by someone who was not at present, right? Some by someone. So what are the textbooks or biographies and history who was wrote by some other people, but he is the person who is not at present at the time, will be considered as a secondary source here, right? The charts and then graphs, images should also be an example of secondary source when after that, even after the time period only. So before the time period means, then it should not become a secondary source. Once that event is done, so once that one is completed, and the information what I'm getting after the event will be considered as a secondary source. So now let me show some of the pictures here, so that you can able to classify whether it becomes a primary source or secondary source. So identifying this type of images should be very difficult, whether it is a primary or secondary, since in order to make since you are going to get the data from multiple ways and multiple sources, how to guessing is very important, right? So classify this whether it may be a primary or secondary. So this should be a magazine. So what should be the magazine? Should it becomes and comes under the primary source here. And then uh, when text what I have written, what may be a right. So this should also become a primary source. And then picture. So picture should also be become an example of the primary source. And history of medicine textbooks, right? So but if the person is not present at the time, that should become secondary. But what is the information I'm getting from the textbook should be a primary source only, right? And then maps. So maps should also be considered. So suppose I want to identify the location, and I have to see the place where it is exactly located. So from that, what I have to do, I have to get only that maps. So maps should also be example of the primary source here. And then newspapers, information what I get from the newspaper should also be comes under the primary source only, right? So like this, we have to identify this whether the information what I'm getting is the primary or secondary. I have to identify. And the next one is that pictures. So pictures should also become an example of this primary source. And then camera reel. So camera reel will also be become an example of primary source. And the autobiography or the magazine or textbook and histories and all should also become the example of the primary source. And then this one also become example of the primary source here. And then the graphs are what I have written, and then photography, and then charts, right? So all these examples, they should become the example of this primary source. And this should also become a primary source example. And then drawings and then graphs should also become a primary source example. And then uh, photography, and then this magazines, or right, or right, and personal diaries and pictures, like this. So this one will also be the example of the primary source here. So the diaries means who has going to be written by something, and then drawings, and then paintings or whatever it may be, and then the biological textbooks and all magazines, whatever it is. So this one all comes under the primary source. And then the information what I'm getting from through telephone, and then someone the person of the magazine or whatever it may be, and then the printed instruments or printing text of material, and then write pictures of the drawings or paintings, whatever it may be. So all this also becomes under the primary source here. And then the photography on then photographs, whatever it may be, should also be an example of this primary source. And then the songs and the items, whatever it may be, and then artifact, historical artifacts like tools, whatever having, and then the back bibliography of means, so there should be magazine or pet textbook. So this also be the example of the primary sources. So these are the some of the pictures I have shown the example of this primary and secondary here. So what it may be, some magazines, and then prime, and then newspapers, and then photography, and then history of the medicine, or that is a textbook, whatever maybe should answer comes under the primary source. And then maps, and then newspapers, what I am having, that should be also be example of the primary source. And then pictures, and then magazines, and then tapes, what I am having, and the information what I'm getting from this photography should also be example of the primary source. And then the charts of like whether it be bar chart should also be example of that. And then photographs, and then uh, textbooks or personal diaries, and then paintings or drawings like this. And then what I have shown the information what I'm getting from through telephone, and then the information what I'm getting from that picture or magazine or history of the person who is not at present, and then some photographical of historical photographies from that information what I'm getting here, and then the songs, and then historical tools like artifacts, and then textbooks or maybe a magazine like this. With this and all some of the examples of this primary and secondary sources. Okay, thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.